Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin Meyer. I am the Sustainable Food Programs Coordinator at the University of California, Merced. Today we are here to talk to Matt Mikkelsen, who does a ton of stuff, and we're really going to talk about silence, which seems a little contradictory, but we'll see how it goes. And Guillermo, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everyone. I'm Guillermo Ortiz. I am the Sustainability and Diversity Educational Programs Manager here with the Office of Sustainability at UC Merced. Started this series with Erin to really feature and cover different aspects of sustainability and get an opportunity to hear about folks, what inspires them to go into this line of work, and what personal influences really spark them in their journey. So on that note, Matt, thank you so much for choosing to be a part of this process and sharing your story with us.
Totally. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Matt, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Matt Mikkelsen. I use he, him pronouns. I live in Duluth, Minnesota these days, but I'm always kind of somewhere. I've been working as a sound designer and sound recordist for the better part of a decade, and really specializing in quiet places and nature sounds. And that work really led me to the realization that we have no quiet places left. Noise pollution's everywhere. I can ramble for a long time, but it's a resource that needs to be protected. And that's kind of, I think, why I'm here today, is like why I really focus on sound as a resource, and using like different acoustic ecology practices to recognize it as a resource and help people manage it as a resource.
I already have so many questions. I'm excited.
Me too. I have a lot of questions as well.
Hopefully you get some answers too, I guess. All right, so it seems appropriate for us to start with a moment of silence. So if you all want to bear with me and just take a moment to meditate, be here with us, be here now. I'm going to mute myself too, because you might hear some background noise going on. They're putting in gutters today, which is like the best timing for them to do this. So you might hear some banging, but I'm going to mute myself starting now. Have a good minute. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had an excellent moment of silence. All right, let's jump in. So we'll start with questions from the audience. If anyone has any, feel free and unmute. If that's uncomfortable, you can also put them in the chat and we can read them out loud, whatever you prefer.
I do have a question, given that Matt, we were just talking about both being from New Jersey. I'm from northern New Jersey, and I can't say that it's a quiet place, either the people or the surroundings for that matter. And so how did you, also being from New Jersey, obviously from Hunterdon County, how did you get into this body of work, right? And when did you come to the realization of its importance?
Yeah, that's a great question. Erin, I also want to thank you for the moment of silence. It never gets old. That's like just such a great thing to do, is to take a minute and be quiet. I feel like I just started a new day. So I was grew up and was really into music. I wanted to be a professional musician. I was gonna, be in like a rock band. I'm a drummer. Like I make a lot of noise. And so yeah, that's what I wanted to do. And at some point I realized, okay, well, I'm not quite a good enough musician to put food on the table doing it that way. So I decided to get into engineering and sound recording, and decided to go to college for that, and went to Ithaca College in Central New York next to Cornell University. They have a really great film and music program there. And so, yeah, I studied sound recording technology and audio engineering there. And like 6 months into my freshman year there, I was loving my studies. I really felt like I was enjoying it a lot, but I realized I was kind of setting myself up for a life spent in like a dark studio. And I've been lucky enough and very privileged to like grow up in a really beautiful place. My parents were always outside, and we were going hiking and backpacking and kayaking and all these beautiful things. And I was trying to figure out a way how to bring like my love of music and sound, my love of being outside, and then also this real realization that like we need to work to save our planet, all to one career that I could find. And that's when I heard about Gordon Hempton and his work, which is well documented, and his kind of search to save the last remaining quiet places. And I sent Gordon an email as like an 18-year-old kid and was like, hey, what you do sounds super cool. I'd love to hear more about it or see if I could get involved somehow. And we hopped on a call for like 3 hours. And by the end of that call, I had planned a trip to go study with him for a few weeks out in Washington State. And that was, almost 10 years ago now. So I just fell in love with listening to nature and trying to find quiet. And it's a quest that brings me new places and lets me meet new people. And I feel very lucky.
And to follow that up, there's been like a fair amount of research on what nature kind of inspires in the term of what we call awe-inspiring moments. And as someone who also just likes to get off the beaten path and go out there, in a state like California, there are so many options to do that. And you have these moments where you're just completely at a loss for words, or words aren't necessary in some of these spaces. When's the last time, right, that you felt that going out in the outdoors, and where were you, and what was your surrounding like?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's so magical that like when we're struck with awe, that like words don't do justice. And what I like to kind of like remind people is we hold silence in times where we don't have words. Like when we have moments of silence in times of great tragedy or loss or remembrance. Silence holds things that like we can't really verbalize and don't need to be verbalized. But yeah, that feeling of like awe that we get being outside and connecting with the outdoors is obviously really special. And I am lucky that I get to experience that a lot. Maybe like selfishly, that's why I do what I do. So I can have that feeling as much as possible. Because I really think it's like, standing under a really bright starry night, when you can like see the Milky Way, it just takes your breath away and you can stare at it forever. And there's like, time doesn't pass the same way. I think the same thing happens when you're in a quiet place. Whereas like everything else kind of falls away and you're just in that moment, in that place, and just full of like gratitude and wonder. And last time I felt that was, on Thursday. And because I just finished a trip, a data gathering trip in Saskatchewan and northeastern Montana. So I was in Montana and was in our super, super quiet place and just watching the sunrise over the prairie and nearly like tears in my eyes, just thinking, holy crap, I feel so lucky to be sitting in this place right now. So yeah, I feel super, super lucky all the time I get to have that experience.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So I was trying to think about my most recent awe moment, and I don't really have the transportation as well as time to go out to the beaten path very often, even though when I do, I love it. And I need to make more time for it. And we live so close to Yosemite, and I like do not get out there enough. But my most recent moment of awe, I got this bouquet of flowers from our local farmers market, and they were beautiful. But what was the most beautiful part about it was the back side of them where the stem connects. It was so beautiful and perfect and pretty that I had this like awe moment where I just had to like stop what I was doing and appreciate it. And I think we can find those little things even in the urban areas. And it doesn't always have to be nature. Maybe it's with your dog or something, right? Or with your family. So I guess I have two questions. One of which is, how do we create more of these awe moments? And then my second question is, when you were talking about, we have these moments of silence for disasters and all these other things, like why are all of those things usually negative? Why can't we have moments of silence for like, oh my God, COVID is over, if and when that ever happens, you know, like can we have a moment of silence for something really positive happening?
Those are both such great questions. Yeah, I think to answer your first question about like bringing those awe-inspiring experiences closer to your everyday, it's so important because one is like most of us don't have the resources, the time, the means to like get out to the middle of nowhere and like have a quiet experience that is obviously really awe-inspiring. And it's important that we can access these things every day. It shouldn't be like, I really feel like an experience like that shouldn't be a luxury. And unfortunately, it has become a luxury. So, I mean, I'll talk more about this, I'm sure, later, but I helped start this nonprofit called Quiet Parks International. And one of our programs is called Urban Quiet Parks. And essentially, we really feel like in every city, we should have a place that we can go to appreciate quiet. And of course, you know, it'll never be as quiet. You know, you'll never find a spot in San Francisco that's as quiet as the middle of Montana. But can we find a place that's quieter than the rest of the surrounding areas and bring people to those places to have these meaningful experiences? And the answer is yes. We've already established a handful of parks. There's a lot more coming. But I think through that, through like appreciation of your senses is a great way to just ground you in space. I know like I deal with anxiety like a lot of people do. And one of the things they tell you is when you're feeling anxious is to like put yourself grounded in your space and you use your senses to interact with the world. So if you can actively use your senses to try and connect you with place, that's really amazing. And when you start really thinking about your senses as separate entities, like how often do you stop during your day and ask yourself what you're smelling? It's not often that we do that, but when you're confronted with like a beautiful bouquet of flowers and you get a whiff of them, like you can't help but just live in that moment and keep burying your face in a bouquet of flowers. Or when you're in a quiet place, like you can't help but listen to the birds or listen to wind through trees. When you're at an overlooking Yosemite Falls, like how are you not supposed to look at that and just be totally lost in it? And I think that really is so key. It's just like trying to bring those experiences to your everyday. The second question you had was about joy related to silence versus sadness, I guess, related to silence, and why we hold silence for these really, usually in a lot of times, these kind of very hard times. And the first time that I remember having a moment of silence was for 9/11. Like I'm of that age group where that was one of like the really big moments in my childhood. But what's interesting is I think in our culture, we use sound and silence as a way to kind of represent sadness or contemplation. But that's only kind of in our culture. In a lot of Asian cultures and in places that aren't North America, you see silence used as a tool for celebration more. There's a really amazing documentary called In Pursuit of Silence by Patrick Shin and a bunch of other very talented folks. And they kind of look at silence and how it's used culturally all over the world. But yeah, usually when we're happy, we yip and holler and play music and dance. And it's interesting that we hold silence for the not as happy events in our life.
I'm gonna have to watch this documentary. That sounds awesome.
It is such a beautiful film. Oh my gosh, so incredible.
That does sound like a great documentary. Definitely something I'm gonna check out. I'm checking the chat right now, and it seems like we got a question that came in. How do you help people who have always been surrounded by sounds and who get uncomfortable in quiet places?
Yeah, that is such a good question, and one I get so much because we're surrounded by so much sound all the time. And our brain is constantly processing sound. So even if we're not consciously thinking about it, your brain is picking apart all this information that's coming in through your ears just 24/7. Even when you're asleep, your brain is analyzing sound and determining what's a threat, what's not a threat. That car that drives by on your street, it lets you sleep through. When your alarm goes off in the morning, your brain tells you to wake up. So your brain's like really busy working at deciphering what's important information and what's information we can just kind of like let go. And when you get into a place where you can identify all the information happening around you, like in a quiet place, all this information becomes audible. Your brain has a tough time turning the switch off. So it can be really overwhelming to find yourself as a person, and myself included, we're always surrounded by all these sounds. All of a sudden you're in a place where you can't really hear either. You can't hear anything, or you can hear like every bird in a tree and nothing else, or just the wind blowing through. I think it's your body starting to absorb information in a different way than it's used to. And it doesn't have all that noise, all that like background sound, the distant cars on the road, the humming of the refrigerator, all these other sounds that we come accustomed to. It doesn't have that input anymore. So all of a sudden it's like you have 20/20 vision. You can hear for miles around you, 360 degrees. It's super freaky, and obviously pretty uncomfortable if you're not used to it. And what I tell people is to like give yourself doses of it. If you want to experience it and it makes you uncomfortable, you can give yourself smaller doses. Maybe going on a 3-night backpacking trip to a quiet place by yourself, not such a great idea. But maybe driving to a place that's a little quieter and like having a picnic with a friend, where you can take these kind of bite-sized chunks of quiet places and solitude, can really be helpful. And I feel it too, like when I go out into the field, it takes me a few days to adjust. And I was just with a friend doing this, this data collection in these super quiet places. And he said that he was almost having like the opposite of overstimulation in a really overwhelming way. It was like there was like almost a weight on him because it was like there was so much space all of a sudden. And I told him to just kind of like lean into that and figure out what that means and why it feels that way. And I think we learn a lot about ourselves when we put ourselves in uncomfortable situations, but just make sure you do it in a way that still feels like safe and supportive to yourself. So I'd say, yeah, if you know someone or you personally get uncomfortable and quiet, kind of dig into it in these bite-sized chunks, because it can become such a beautiful tool for you to use in your life throughout your life. Yeah.
Great answer. Someone mentioned meditation in the chat, and also I think it's a matter of reaction-based practice for silence versus intention-based practice. So much of our life is reaction versus intentional action. Listening is a great gateway practice, and inserting silence in between listening and responding is important. And this is why meditation is increasingly popular. I agree. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on meditation?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't practice meditation in a structured way. At this point in my life, earlier, when I was younger, I did experiment with it or used it as a tool. And I think what I've learned is that when I was meditating, at least, what I was told is that the intention is the goal. So if you intend to meditate, you've done it successfully. A lot of people try and meditate and they say, oh my God, I'm so bad at meditating. But if you take it from what I'm told, at least, is if you take it from like the Buddhist approach, meditating in itself is the goal, then you've done a good job. And I find that I try and bring that into my listening practice where some days I'm good at listening, some days I'm not so good at listening. And it can be for all sorts of reasons. But the goal of listening, just to set out to be a better listener, if I can do that at the beginning of my day, then I've done a good job. And I think we all deal with that in all of our jobs. There's like, everyone has to deal with paperwork and computers and like endless Zoom meetings and like all this other stuff that we all have to deal with. But I think like your intention, like if you're working towards a goal and you set out in the beginning of your day to further that goal, you've done a good job. And I think for me, listening has been a really powerful tool in helping me become like more self-aware and increasing the depth of my interpersonal relationships. I try and say that like everything for me kind of falls into place when I'm in quiet. All these like really big complicated questions that I have unanswered, or the problems I'm having, or my like family drama, or whatever might be ailing me at the time. When I go to a quiet place and I just sit and think and breathe and listen, those things kind of all become it's not like a light bulb moment, but they all just feel a lot better. And I hear people describe similar things with meditation, is that it's not like you're fixing your problems, but you're kind of meeting them face to face in a really interesting way and sitting with them. And yeah, so I think listening as a meditation practice is a well-established thing. But even just the goal of, like we did before, having a minute of silence, like that's a really powerful tool to just help you take a break. We're so overwhelmed with so much stuff all the time that just taking even a minute to yourself to breathe and to just listen is like, can do wonders for you. It really can. I truly believe that. And science has shown us it can as well.
I agree. And it makes you better in every other aspect of your life, like mentally, physically, emotionally.
Totally.
So I had a question that came in via email a few weeks ago when I first started promoting this. And I'm just going to read the whole email because there's two parts of it. Hi, Aaron. This sounds like a fascinating opportunity. Our city council is currently considering major changes in our leaf blower ordinance, parentheses, including eventually outlawing gas-powered leaf blowers. Some of us would like to speed that process up, not only because of the noise, but because they're so destructive to good plant and wildlife practices. Should I tune in and ask a question about leaf blowers? Do you know if Matt has had any expertise with that kind of advocacy? I might try to get some of my colleagues here in Evanston to join if you think he does. Great programming, Debbie. P.S. Just recently, I learned that a Chicago colleague, Pete Leckie, published a children's book on this topic. I haven't seen the book yet and talked to Pete lately. I wonder if Matt knows about this book, The Fight Between Quiet and Noise, Picture Book, 2018.
Wow. I'm taking notes if you can't tell, because I'm learning things as well. Yeah, so like I study a lot of the issues and intricacies of noise pollution, and leaf blowers are like a really big really big issue when it comes to noise and like pollution in general. Leaf blowers are like so horrible for the environment in a lot of ways, as I have one sitting in my garage, obviously. So none of us are free from the gripes of leaf blowers. I think it's interesting to see what different communities are doing kind of all around the world when it comes to noise ordinances and specifying specific types of tools in noise ordinances. I think one of the most kind of, in terms of success, what I've seen work really well is when you have a community that has some sort of like housing association, let's say, and they get to vote on a measure to decrease noise pollution. And what they can do is say, okay, so on Tuesdays and Thursdays between the hours of 11 a.m. and 3 p.m., you can do your yard work. And that can be leaf blowing, that can be lawn mowing, you can use chainsaws, whatever, because people will still have to do that stuff probably eventually, or want to do that stuff. Or I mean, leave the leaves on the grass. It's fine. It'll provide nourishment for them. We all know this. But I think setting up ways that people can still do the things they think they need to do without like outlawing them completely might be helpful. Not that I don't want to see leaf blowers like all turned electric and quiet, because I think that'd be a better way to go. But I think what I've seen work for different communities are these kinds of more structured way to help prevent noise pollution in their community. We work with a lot of communities and get questions from a lot of city councilors and HOAs and all these other people asking about just kind of this different stuff and what would be impactful. And I'm happy to talk with anyone more if you want to send them my information. But yeah, so I think what we're going to see more and more is people want to find quiet places. And even in the 10 years I've done this work, the momentum that we have going forward for people who really not only want to be in quiet, but need to find quiet to like deal with their stress is just increasing more and more. So I think we're going to see a lot of cities and neighborhoods start to really try and figure out ways that they can decrease the amount of noise pollution that they're facing, especially if you live on a like crowded block and like once a week someone is mowing the lawn or blowing leaves. That's really kind of a bummer, you know, doesn't leave a whole lot of time for you to have quiet, especially, you know, that's what I'd say. So I don't know if I exactly answered the question, but I think there's some really good ways to kind of bring around these conversations of like, how do we work to as a community and individually within our communities to kind of bring attention to the fact that like, yeah, we should be trying to have quiet as a resource in where we live, because quiet's really good for us as humans. It's really good for children. It's good for animals and birds and everything. So the more we can kind of bring that, not just into these really wilderness, wild places, but into the neighborhoods we live in, the better off we'll be, I think.
Yeah, Matt, that reminds me, like, how do we define, right, a quiet place? 'Cause I'm thinking, even for my own sake, I'm a person who has to have like some, like when I sleep, like either a fan or something in the air. I think it brings me peace. I think one of my favorite things, and I wonder if this is quiet or not quiet. To my family and I are, I'm Puerto Rican, born and raised in New Jersey though, but the beach and specifically the sound of waves in an ocean is extremely calming. It feels like home in that regard. So, you know, how much noise suddenly takes a place from necessarily being a quiet place, or you know, I'm sure it's not as like bricked off as like all of a sudden once you reach a certain decibel, right, you're no longer in quiet places, but like how do you go about defining those spaces and you know that then measuring like how we're losing those spaces, I guess?
Totally. It's such a good question. And I really should have started off with just some definitions. We talk about, and you know, philosophers debate around the sound versus noise. Those are like the two categories you have. Noise is anything that covers up valuable information, in my opinion. So let's say you're an owl and you're hunting for mice in a bush that's 100 yards away from you. If there's a highway next to you, all that sound coming from the highway, while it's sound, it's noise because it's interfering with important information that you need to do what you need to do. If you are sitting there, let's say with a child and you're trying to do homework with them, or you're trying to teach them something, and you have the sound of your neighbor's leaf blower interrupting you and you need to raise your voice so they can hear you better, or it's distracting for them, that is noise pollution. And noise and sound can trade places depending on who you're asking, the environment you're in, all these things. But when I talk about a quiet place or a naturally silent place, I'm talking about places that are very free from noise pollution or experience a lot less noise pollution than your average place. The metric we use is 15 minutes. If you can find a place that doesn't experience noise pollution for 15 minutes at a time, it's probably one of the last great quiet places in the world, which is astounding because 15 minutes sounds like not a lot of time.
Yeah, I was going
But
to say
there's
that
all
sounds...
this, yeah. It seems like, oh, of course, there's tons of places like that. But like you look at an air traffic map, you look at transportation noise maps, there are so few places left around the world that have that 15-minute noise-free interval. It's like it's a diamond in the rough. So it's interesting. I too, when I'm like outside and camping, which I do all the time, I really struggle with not having some sort of constant sound source because your brain starts picking up all these little things. And all of a sudden you might be sleeping outside with or maybe you're just sleeping with your window open and you hear like a squirrel hopping through your yard. And it sounds like a bear is like, tromping through because your brain is trying to pick things up for its survival. So a lot of people I know need to sleep with something on, white noise, a fan. I sleep really well with a fan on. Or you fall asleep listening to an audiobook or to the TV. I think that's like a way that we can actively choose our auditory environment in a way that makes us feel comforted and makes us feel at home. And it's a really powerful tool. So I know that was like a really long, rambly answer to your question, but yeah, so there's like noise, there's sound, there's quiet places, all those things kind of, Yosemite Falls is like 90 decibels at its peak. It's so loud. It's like deafeningly loud, but at the same time, it's quiet because there's no noise pollution or no audible noise pollution. So you really start to like think about the Venn diagram where all these things overlap, and
there's definitely nuance there. And honestly,
oh my gosh,
I was glad that you mentioned philosophy, because I mean, so much of philosophy was just observing, or trying to explain our natural world and the things that we perceive with our senses. And so I actually did not know that there is like a debate between sound versus noise in that kind of thinking space, but it makes sense. What else has kind of, from your example and your work, do you feel is tied to sound that we don't really discuss as much as a society? Really could be anything on that front, but what do you feel like we're missing out of the discussion in a world where we, are constantly bombarded with everything from social media to entertainment, sounds, colors, everything is shooting at us at a million miles an hour. But what if you had something to really highlight to some people to think about sound in a way that they traditionally don't on a day-to-day basis? What would you kind of have to say to them?
Yeah, this is like, the stuff that keeps me up at night.
Always thinking about it's an easy question, right?
Yeah, so easy. I think to me, what's really powerful about sound, and again, I can only speak from my perspective, but like our hearing, I truly believe is our most powerful sense for a lot of reasons. And like evolutionarily, we can talk about how like we don't have earlids, but we have eyelids, and there's no like mammal species that can't hear, and all these other like weird things that kind of point us in the direction that your hearing is super important. But it just kind of comes down to practice too. Like when you need to wake up in the morning and you're dead asleep, what sense do we use to alert ourselves it's time to wake up? It's our phone or it's our alarm that goes off. It's a sound that emits. Our brain is like ready to accept that information. It's also like amazing to think about, like if you close your eyes and someone is speaking behind you, you can be turned away from them like feet away, but you can precisely pinpoint their location just using your ears. Your hearing is so powerful and so sensitive. Like in the right listening environment, you can hear sounds miles and miles away. And I've been in situations where I've heard sounds that are 10 miles away from where I'm standing, which is like, I didn't even consider that a possibility.
Yeah.
I heard a freight train 10 miles away from where I was. So like you start kind of adding up all these things, and sound is a super important part of how we navigate through the world. And we underutilize that sense in our culture for sure. There's so much power to be had in learning how to listen and just paying more attention to what you're hearing. It's really fun. It's like a really fun way to move about the world is through listening. And we're such a visually dominant culture. We're all about what we see, which I'm also like a photographer and a filmmaker. So I love that stuff too.
Yeah, I was about to say like the where we probably interact the most with sound. I'm thinking of like audiophiles who are really into music, or for those who are in the gaming space, right? Twitch, right, and streaming, and then like having the right mic setup, or if you're a movie aficionado, right, like Dolby, and like creating surround sound speaker systems so that we can like that can actually change the experience of watching certain movies. So I definitely hear what you're saying about just how powerful that sense is overall.
Yeah, it really is. And the more you dig into it, the more you find, which is really beautiful. And same thing, with like appreciating what you're smelling or what you're seeing, or, the more you like lean into it, the more you try and appreciate, the more there is to appreciate, which is like, it's so beautiful.
I think we have a question in chat. To your point about stress-related noise pollution, have you come across sound specifications to help make spaces and content more accessible for the neurodiverse?
Oh my God, such a great question. Short answer is yes. There's a lot of work being done in this space. And not only for people who are neurodiverse, but that work really impacts them very specially. But for us as well, we're starting to learn in kind of all of our fields in psychology and in architecture, and that we've built spaces that aren't conducive to the way that we receive information. And when you're neurodiverse, especially, we should be taking extra time to kind of curate these spaces in ways that make sense and that allow people to be comfortable. So I don't personally do a ton of work in that space. However, I work with a lot of people who are, I really think, at the cutting edge of that space. There's a group, there's a laboratory called Orfield Labs, run by Steve Orfield. They are well known for having the quietest room in the world. I think they still have the Guinness Book of World Records. But they're a multi-sensory lab. And the Orfields in general, as a family, have been doing a lot of work about how we can create spaces for neurodiverse people to live much happier, less stressful lives, or just be more comfortable. And so their work on that is super impressive. In particular, there's someone who I work with. Her name is Emma Orfield Johnston. She's the granddaughter of Steve Orfield. She is like really leading the way in a lot of this work. And it's really amazing to hear what she's doing. So I would recommend trying to get in touch with her, because she's a really amazing resource. Oh, and Aaron dropped a link for Orfield Labs in the chat.
Aaron.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, I'll put some of these resources in the email after this. I wanted to talk about inequities in other ways as well. There's this article, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's in a journal of environmental health perspectives. It's entitled Inequality of Noise Exposures, a Portrait of the US. It was put out in 2017. Just the first paragraph is a good starting point. Noise pollution has been associated with adverse cardiovascular and neurological outcomes. It is also unevenly distributed across cities and landscapes, and, like many environmental hazards, tends to disproportionately affect lower income and non-white individuals. The authors of a new study in environmental health perspectives provide an initial assessment of socioeconomic inequality in environmental noise exposures across the contiguous US. So I'll put the link to that in the chat as well. And I don't really know what the question here is, but I did want to raise that and elevate that as a problem, that like people face so many inequities, and then they also have noise pollution, which causes heart problems and all the other things. And I live in Merced, California, literally right in between two of the railroad tracks. And the people that live next to them, like literally right next to them, I do not know how they sleep at night. They probably don't sleep at night. And it's such an issue. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts on how we can, I guess, reduce the inequities there, besides like putting in some of these ordinances?
Yeah, it's really such a super important point. I'm so glad you brought it up, is that like everything, we see that pollution, regardless of what type of pollution it is, noise, water, air, et cetera, affects poorer communities, communities of color at a much higher rate than others. And when I think I work in conservation a lot, and so I'm working with wildlife biologists and other ecologists, and I have a very narrow specialty, which is acoustic ecology. I study noise pollution and sound propagation and all these things. But I think we do ourselves a disservice, not just in conservation, but when we talk about equity, or we talk about making our neighborhoods and cities more just and better places for everyone, especially communities of color, we do ourselves a disservice by saying like, oh, well, we just should worry about like lead pipes and delivering clean water, or just worry about the noise pollution from the train tracks, or just worry about this one issue that's really easy to kind of pick out, because everything is working together to create those environments. Not saying that anyone was suggesting that we would do that, but I think there's this kind of habit to say that like we, one, have done our city planning to maybe disenfranchise, maybe, but disproportionately affects poorer communities, communities of color. And that includes like flight paths. Like look at any major city's airport, and you can see where their flight paths come in. They're routing the planes over the poorer communities. And then when we see psychological studies that show that like children in these neighborhoods are falling behind, and then we see another study that says, oh, noise pollution negatively affects a child's cognitive abilities to process information. It's like all this stuff is all playing together. And if we try and just fix one of those things, we're not going to have a huge impact. Like we really need to look at the whole picture. And to say that anything exists in a vacuum, I think is a disservice to all these issues that we need to work on. So yeah, there's a lot of people who have done amazing writing about how like city planning and noise pollution sources are a map of like essentially like a racist society. That puts people at greater health risk and greater risk for all these other issues based on like where they think they need to. And this is something we're seeing play out all over the United States in so many places. So other than looking at specific kind of ordinances and like specific measures, which we can do, but they're so specific to these communities in general. Like Seattle has done a great job of trying to reroute their flights to affect as little people as possible and putting timetables on their flights. And there's a big push to kind of just recognize how it's disproportionately affecting communities of color in Seattle. I think prioritizing health and well-being is something that we're starting to realize and we're starting to prioritize. And once we start to seek quiet and seek clean air and clean water, which shouldn't be like luxury items, we kind of see that all those things come at the same time. And I always try and say that soundscapes are, people are like, why study sound? Like why not focus on something more impactful like soil contamination or air pollution? And what we see with sound, by studying sound, we get a great indicator of what the overall health of an ecosystem is, whether it's human inhabited or not. So if you have a really quiet soundscape and that soundscape doesn't experience a lot of noise pollution and it's really biodiverse, then that ecosystem also probably doesn't have like a coal-fired power plant in it, and there's not resource extraction,
right,
and not all these other things that go along with it. So yeah, by just thinking about a very small sect of noise pollution, we end up being able to use it as a lens to look at these really big systemic problems that are happening, not just in our natural spaces, but in our built environments as well.
Matt, that's that's a great point. I think previously I had done some work with environmental justice organizations, and part of the discussions within those circles was always not that, like, not in an unrealistic sense, right? That we can get to a point where there's absolutely no pollution and there's no impacts from, human society existing and interacting with the planet. But I think a big part of the argument in environmental justice communities is why is the burden being only suffered by a very small segment of people, despite, right, the fact that this is ongoing in society. So it's not just like, ideally, yes, we cut down our pollution, we do the right thing, but it's like, why are we rerouting our planes only around those communities, right? Like, why are we doing it? And like, the answer is, like, with wealth and money, you can lobby, you can go to your council member, you can et cetera, to make sure that you can create an environment for you to thrive. But then if you don't have those resources, when it comes to the planning decisions of where a landfill will go, or where a waste incinerator or a coal plant, et cetera. And so I think it's a great point that you've made about the need to look at pollution in all forms and understanding the impacts of pollution across different segments of society, so that we can better plan and create more equitable design decisions, both in our indoor and outdoor environment. And I think that's always been something that's been kind of playing out also in the conversations around land conservation and et cetera. It's like, who has access to these spaces? Like, who is it's like, are folks from Oakland, do they have who are people of color, do they have access to Yosemite, right? Or even John Muir National Monument, for something closer? That conversation, I think, is important. And I'm glad that even within your own space, those are considerations that, and you're right, people tend to think of water pollution, they tend to think of these other sources, but it goes to show, right, how much we take sound for granted in certain spaces.
Yeah. And I really believe the people who can benefit the most from quiet are not white boys like me, not saying that I don't benefit from it. I do, but I also have easiest access to it. People who need these resources most and who can benefit from these resources most have the least access to them. And when we try and focus on just bringing access to a very small percentage of users, this is not how we bring about a more just society. And I don't have I don't have the answers for why we've routed planes over poor communities of color and exactly why we've done all these things. But I can say, hey, I study sound. Look at what's happening here. And it's in some ways, I think the more that we can work together and all lend our specialties to these conversations, the better result we're going to end up having. Yes, we need to replace the water pipes in Flint, Michigan, but we need to dig deeper. It's not just about replacing the water pipes. Let's look at what has happened to that community over the past 100 years, and really try and dig into these things. Why in the first place do we even need to be replacing the water pipes? Because it shows a lot more. We can't just keep band-aiding these really big issues. Talk about food security. You talk about, climate change. You talk about all these things. We want to band-aid them, and band-aiding doesn't really work for that long.
Well, it's difficult, and prior to coming here to Merced, I was working in Washington, D.C. In Congress, and so what I think is, and what I find many folks who tend to work on environmental issues tend to understand or tend to see that siloing of policy, of regulation, is almost impossible when it comes to environment. It's like we we do that as humans to like organize and put it so it works in our brain, and then we go out into the natural world, and then we realize that it's so interconnected. It is, everything is relational in nature. It's systems in nature, and they're puzzle pieces that work together. And you start messing around with things, suddenly it unravels. It's very difficult to understand that, and pollution is, of course, the same way. It's intersectional in its approach, and we need to look at it in that way. We have to be intersectional in our solutions, or else we'll never really get, as you mentioned, never get to the core of why these problems are popping up in the first place.
Totally. And I think it's like, we can blame politicians for a lot of things. And if you put yourself in the shoes of a politician, they're trying to bring these sometimes abstract concepts to their voting base or to the room. They have 3 minutes to pitch why we need to reroute all the planes in the United States around wilderness areas. It's a really hard thing to do without siloing. Like it helps if they can have these things kind of siloed. So, in a lot of ways, like the nonprofit, I wished we lived in a world where we didn't need nonprofits to do this work. And I think what's great about like our nonprofit, and I know a lot of nonprofits we work with, is like we don't need to wait on politicians or governmental bodies to approve what we're doing. If we want to work directly with communities to preserve resources or to grant resources or to make available resources to people, we can do that. And I think that's really powerful, especially when you have a lot of people willing to give their time and energy and money. It's a beautiful tool to be able to work within the system we have.
Absolutely. Thanks. Aaron, did you have any? I know we're coming up to 3, but were there any remaining questions or any questions that you had, or folks on the call?
Well, one that came in from chat, is it Emma Orfield Johnson or Johnston?
Yes, it is Johnston with a T. And if you go to, I can drop a link for our team page on our Quiet Parks International, shameless plug for our nonprofit here. But the team of folks that are on this page, one is we're all volunteers. No one is making money from any of this. But there's an incredible amount of beautiful minds on that team page who specialize in everything from city planning to built environment to creating spaces for neurodiverse folks. There's really such a beautiful amount of resource just in looking at that team page. And if anyone here wants to get in touch with someone from the team page and you can't find their contact info, let me know and I can put my contact info in the chat so you have it and I'll connect you with them for sure.
Awesome, thank you. I did have a question. I don't know if we can get to it with 3 minutes. I think we could. Did your work get more or less busy with COVID? Because in some ways, like everyone was rushing to national parks, right? So was it busier in that sense? But then there were also times where Yosemite shut its doors. The bus that goes up to Yosemite stopped bus routes up there. So I would just be interested to know, were you busier or not with COVID? Not that it's done, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's gotten a lot busier. I think people, one thing that's been universal about this pandemic, while there's been a lot of inequities in a lot of other ways, one thing that's been universal is that we've all had a lot of time to sit and think and kind of realize what's important to us. And a lot of people have been in their homes and spending time in the green spaces that they have access to, and kind of realizing either, hey, it's not that quiet here, or, oh my God, there's no airplanes flying over my house, or, oh my God, there's so many birds here. So I think people have been digging into their surroundings and their environments more and more in the past year and a half. I don't know, time is weird. So yeah, people have been really interested in how sound has played a role and played out through the pandemic. I wrote a piece for Atlas Obscura, just about like the quieting of the world once all the planes were grounded essentially, and no one was really flying, and you could like go to LAX airport and there were no planes taking off or landing. And like I have sound recordings that someone took from Terminal A at LAX, and it's quiet. And it was such an interesting lens into what the world might be like if we prioritized our acoustic surroundings more. And I would never want to hear that quiet again. Obviously, it was not worth the cost, but a really interesting lens into our environment.
Is the name of that article "Here the Soundscapes of Cities Transformed"?
Yes, indeed.
Awesome. I'm going to link that in the chat
Yeah.
and then give it a read later. Since we do have just 1 minute left, any final words of wisdom? We can also end on a moment of silence. I think that would be apropos.
Yeah, it would. I just want to say thank you, and definitely would love to share my contact information. Aaron, I don't know if there's like an easy way in your email to send it out to folks, but I love talking with people. I like freely give my phone number and love just, talking about sound with people. So please feel free to share my email and my phone number. And yeah, I just really appreciate everyone coming and listening today.
Yeah, if you want to send me your phone number and everything, it looks like Lee had a hand up, so we can. Where'd they go?
I think he was waving by.
Oh, that was a oh, okay. I thought maybe there was another question, but bye, Lee. Hopefully, yeah, if you want to give me your phone number, I can put it in the little email I send out after this, and any other kind of resources as well.
Perfect. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I'll send you an email once we're done with another minute of silence.
Awesome. All right.
Cool. Thank you so much. So nice to meet you, Guillermo, and everyone else. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
Thank you. All right. Shall we begin?
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.